Welcome to today's webinar, Prosocial Assertiveness, How to Do No Harm, presented by Dr. Alice Shires. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. My training would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this live webinar from the lands of the Jagera people. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today, and especially those joining this webinar. Hi everyone, my name is Stacey and I am the General Manager of My Training. My Training is a dynamic, future-focused, registered training organisation that empowers individuals and workplaces to meet the challenges of an ever-changing work landscape. We are leaders in enhancing workplace mental health and organisational well-being. Our focus is on enabling individuals and leaders to thrive within their organisational context by developing emotional intelligence, career development strategies, and workplace psychological safety. Dr. Alice Shires is a highly accomplished clinical psychologist, senior lecturer, and director of the UTS Psychology Training Clinic. With over 25 years of experience, she specialises in teaching and cognitive behavioural therapies while also incorporating mindfulness into her practice. She is recognised for her expertise in mindfulness, integrated cognitive behavioural therapy, and is an established trainer in NICBT nationally and internationally. She has also co-authored books, developed assessment tools, and actively contributes to policy development and governmental reports. Dr. Alice Shires is an esteemed practitioner, researcher, and advocate for mindfulness, and I welcome her to the microphone to lead our webinar today.
Hello there. So welcome everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit today about mindfulness and its application in the world of work. And I've got increasingly interested in this because the world of work hasn't got better over the last decade or so. And so we need to be able to bring mindfulness into our lives and into our work. I want to start, though, by talking a little bit about what mindfulness is and perhaps also what mindfulness isn't. So mindfulness, it comes from a long lineage of science based within Eastern kind of religious and Buddhist backgrounds. It's been around for a lot longer than we have, and this very modern re-emergence of mindfulness wrapped within psychology is of course very interesting, but it's important to acknowledge its history. And it was used for the purpose of integrating natural laws into decisions and actions in everyday life. So one didn't practice mindfulness alone out of the context of life. It was to be included in life and included guidelines for how we live our lives and how we conduct ourselves and how we make decisions. So it's a larger tool than perhaps it's being used for now. And there was evidence that mindfulness and the mindfulness meditations and created really not just relaxation, not just to be a little mindfulness, but long-term changes in personality traits, in quite fundamental changes. And that's been written in the literature for kind of, a very long time. What's important, I think, is that we understand that mindfulness isn't just relaxation. There's a lot of commercialization, the mindfulness, that describes or provides mindfulness for things like mindfulness of coloring or mindfulness of chocolate or mindfulness even to make money. And this is really a misuse and a misunderstanding of mindfulness, because mindfulness is not just relaxation. Hopefully, and I hope that you experience that today, relaxation, it can bring about relaxation, but not necessarily, and that's not its primary purpose. So stay aware that if you take up mindfulness training, some people seem to be charging lots of money for what really is ostensibly relaxation. Now, I'm not knocking relaxation, it's great, but it doesn't make these changes that we know can be made using mindfulness. So then what is mindfulness? It's really a means to an end. It's a strategy or a mind training that leads to an investigation of our objective reality. It's a tool of practice. So the idea is that when we meditate, we become more aware of what is occurring in our minds and in our bodies. A tool to investigate this objective reality, and there's a strong stress on objective, because as you may know and notice in yourself, as soon as we notice thoughts or feelings in the body, we make judgments about them, and that can feed into a lot of problems. So to learn to investigate ourselves objectively. Now, to do that, we do need to have a sustained attention. And there's lots of writing about mindfulness and its impact on attention, and that's true. It is very useful for training the attention to be where we want it to be. And we'll come to that when I talk about mindfulness of breath. But the purpose is to train attention, not just for the sake of training attention, but for the purpose of being able to apply this to investigate the objective reality in our mind and body, and to be able to move into further progressive forms of meditation practice. So we need to stabilize the mind and restrain it to some extent, and learn to control our attention to some extent. Obviously, minds are like toddlers, they're not that easy to train, but the mindfulness of breath is the first step. But as well as attention, when we practice, we pay attention, say, to the breath, which is what we're going to talk about later. We're not only training our attention, we're not only investigating the experience of thoughts and the experience of sensations, but we're also practicing to be non-identified. And what I mean by that is that when we have experiences, there's a part of the brain, the default network, it's responsible for looking at or analyzing every experience that we have in relation to how it impacts on me. What does it mean for me? Now, that's a very important function, and we need all of those brain activities to take place to make sense. When I see something, or I hear it, or I smell it, or feel it, I need to know, what does that mean? What is it? What does it mean for me? But of course, that network, when it's overactivated, or when we don't want it to be active, leads to things like rumination, worry, taking everything very seriously, taking every thought as a real reality rather than just a thought, as we find out in practice. So taking an attitude of our mental experiences being transitory, thoughts come and go, and that they're not, we don't need to identify them, with them, we can just observe them as they are, as thoughts. So as we practice mindfulness, we pay attention, we train our attention to what we want it to be focused on. We investigate our internal experience. We don't identify with it. And by doing so, we develop acceptance of the experience, and a non-reactivity, which we call equanimity. Equanimity, the ability to not react, but to accept what is objectively. So a nice way of kind of bringing, if you like, that definition, therefore, of mindfulness. I like the definition of the ability to remain unperturbed by experiences within the framework of one's body and mind in terms of thoughts as a result of objective observation. So equanimity, the development of equanimity, non-reactivity, not equipoise, calmness, relies on awareness of thoughts and somatic sensations, meaning sensations in the body, feelings. As we're aware of thoughts and feelings, but not getting tangled up in them, not applying the identifying with them, then this gives us a chance to observe objectively, to accept, and to manage then to be unperturbed by those experiences. So the goal, really, mindfulness, you can see, is the practice towards a goal of equanimity. And we've been working on trying to develop, like psychologists do, measures, including one, the equanimity scale, which is a measure of equanimity, so that we can look more effectively at the outcomes of mindfulness interventions, such as the one that I work with. So we're going to come on to mindfulness of breath in a minute. And I just want to say too that I'm going to give you a taste of some of what we do in the mindfulness integrated CBT course that we run, and that it's a therapy that we provide and train people in, which integrates both mindfulness of breath, first of all, but then increasingly complex and quite sophisticated forms of meditation, aimed at really learning these skills of objectivity, non-reactivity, equanimity. But we combine it with some strategies taken from cognitive and behavioral therapies, the most powerful ones including exposure and response prevention, meaning that taking on things that we normally avoid and not responding in the same way as we might do. And we also add in a whole section that I'm going to be referring to today on interpersonal skills, because for anyone going through a mindfulness program, whether it's to increase well-being or whether it's to manage, extreme distress on occasions, we all want to get to a point where we can develop some kind of equanimity and apply it in our real lives. So there's an interpersonal stage, which is stage 3 of 4 stages during the program. And I'll give you some references to all of that at the end of today. But in order to give you a bit of a taste, I wanted to show you how I might introduce mindfulness of breath with a client if I was working with them, and then we'll do a little practice that I'll take you through, just a brief one to give you a taste. So to introduce mindfulness of breath, what I start by doing, and I'll ask you to do that now if you're happy to, is to just close your eyes and put your hands on your knees, just sitting upright in a chair with your hands flat on your legs or near your knees, and simply with your eyes shut, try and focus your attention on your breath coming in and out of the nostrils. Whenever you recognize that a thought has hijacked your mind, or that you're now away from simply the breath and observing the breath in the nostrils, raise your finger of your right hand. And when you can bring your attention back away from those thoughts to the nostrils, to the target of noticing the breath in the nostrils, lower your finger. So that's your only instructions. Focus on the breath coming in and out of the nose, and raise your finger when you get distracted, and then bring your finger back down again when you reach your target, back to the breath. This is only 1 minute. So with closed eyes, observing the breath, noticing when your mind has been distracted and taken elsewhere, and then finger down when you bring your attention, back to the breath. And we're ready. Open your eyes. And just have a little moment to reflect on what we should see is that finger going up and down, up and down, up and down. Because when we first start noticing, when we're focusing on the breath, it's very likely that you started to notice all of the thoughts that took you away from the breath. Some of you may have been a little bit more practiced or might have felt they could keep their mind on the breath. But for most people, their mind will have gone to all sorts of places in the past, in the future. What's for dinner tonight? What am I doing later? Or what should I have said that last night? Or what might have come through on my emails? Or all those sorts of distracting thoughts. And so each time our mind we recognize that that's happened, then we can bring our attention back. So off it goes, back it comes, off it goes, back it comes. And that's really the purpose of mindfulness of breath, to train that muscle in the mind to notice a thought that's taken us away from, in this case, the mindfulness of breath, the nostrils, but it could be for other practices. Sometimes it's the breath in the chest or the stomach, or it could be something else. There are different sorts of practice. But every time we notice, because we have to notice it first to be able to bring it back, sometimes we can get lost for long periods of time. And then bringing it back, taking it away, the attention away from the thought, no matter how interesting the thought is, bringing it back to the target, the breath. So it's kind of like three things: noticing, detaching from that thought, and then bringing it back to the breath over and over again. And that's mindfulness of breath. And we'll do this properly for a few minutes in a minute. But one of the things you might notice is that there are some effects to the sorts of thoughts that we think, that distract us. One is a recency effect. So if something's happened to you this morning, it's very likely that all those little, electrical, chemical pathways that make up thoughts in the brain are still active. So you're likely to then be experiencing thoughts that relate to that, what happened recently. Or if something very dramatic happened that was very significant, even if that's just a memory of something, then that's likely to thrust itself up into your attention because it's very salient for you. So sometimes something salient or something that's happened just recently, and also frequency. We find that we start noticing the same old thoughts. The same old. I work with people sometimes where they have thoughts about being stupid or lazy or this or that, and they start noticing when they start practicing, there's that same old thought. And of course, by not engaging with that thought, we're weakening those neural pathways and therefore less likely to think it, because the less we think it, strangely, the less we actually think it. So it's important to withdraw attention and not get involved in those repetitive kind of thoughts. But they will arise, and we're not aiming here to have no thoughts, because the mind thinks all the time, same as the heart beats all the time, the breath happens without us all the time. We just are there to observe and to try and gently bring the attention back. So what I'd like to do, and we've got a little bit of time to do that, is a very brief mindfulness breath exercise. So again, if you're happy to, I'll ask you to shut your eyes in a minute. But first of all, get yourself in a chair that's reasonably comfortable, sitting as reasonably upright. If you have a big, comfortable, slouchy chair, you're likely to go to sleep. And we want to be alert and relaxed. So sitting upright, maybe knees a little bit lower than your buttocks, so that that brings your back straight, neck straight, and just feeling comfortable. And then when you're ready, just gently close down your eyes if you feel that you're comfortable to do that. And of course, if during this you're not comfortable, you can open your eyes. But it'll only be a very brief practice, but I think it might be interesting to you. So when you're ready, eyes closed, neck straight, back straight, sitting comfortably. So we're going to develop a practice in mindfulness of breath. It's about accepting unpleasant experiences within the body and mind as they occur, observing them objectively. We can't always avoid unpleasant things. And so it's important that we develop a capacity for acceptance. When we're able to accept unwanted experiences, then they won't bother us so much. And they'll enable us to feel more relaxed and escape discomfort. We're going to learn a practice that's about objectivity, observing as it is, not how we want it to be. So start to be aware of breath coming in and going out of the nostrils, and pay all attention to your nostrils, to the breath coming in and the breath going out. Not controlled breath, natural breath, without any control. You may feel warmth or movement or cold or some sensations inside the nostrils, around the rim of the nostrils as the air flows in and out. You may feel nothing. Doesn't matter. That's fine. It's just an experience. Just be aware that there is air flowing in and out. Just noticing whether it comes fast, whether it comes slow, whether it's deep or shallow, more on one side, more on the other side. Just observing. Just observing the sensation. And when you're aware of the incoming and the outgoing breath, then there's no future, there's no past, there's simply the present, moment to moment. Your mind's not used to staying in the present moment. It's used to wandering into the past, into the future, but very rarely staying in the present moment. Your challenge is to withdraw your attention from any ongoing thought, understanding it's just a thought, and bringing your attention back to the breath. Keep breathing consciously, very alert, very attentive. Every time a thought arises, see it for what it is, just a thought. Not the truth, not you. Just a thought. Practicing now to see thoughts as they are without engaging in them, without reacting to them, without identifying with them, with a degree of detachment. And just simply observing the breath as it comes in and as it goes out. Trying not to miss any breath. I'm focusing steadily on the in and outgoing breath. Trying to sustain your attention towards your breath for as long as you can. There's no need to count or label or do any mental strategy, because otherwise your mind starts to focus on that strategy rather than simply the breath. So just observe what actually happens rather than thinking about what happens. Learn about your mind by focusing on your breath from moment to moment without judging. The longer you practice, the more changes you'll notice. And if you practice regularly, you'll notice changes in your daily activities that will enable you to focus better, gain time, be less bothered by intrusive thoughts, and develop a degree of self-confidence and self-control. So keep practicing steadily, focusing on your incoming and outgoing breath. And every time your mind wanders, don't be disappointed or defeated. Bring your attention back smilingly to the awareness of respiration at the entrance of the nostrils. Keep on focusing on the in and outgoing breath, sustaining your attention there for as long as you can. And in the final few moments, simply just observe those last breaths. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back to the group. Wonderful. So if anyone has questions about this practice, we'll have some time at the end, hopefully, for some questions and comments about the practice. That's an introduction to a practice that within MICBT is practiced daily and then leads on to further forms of practice, but hopefully gives you a little taster of the kind of focusing and the kinds of instructions that mindfulness practice should contain. So I'll give you a sort of few seconds to move around, give yourself a little stretch. And then what I wanted to do was move on to the second part of this talk, which is about how to apply mindfulness and equanimity and the development of equanimity into our interpersonal relationships. And that's what we'll come to now. So I wanted to talk specifically about assertive communication. There are some other components to interpersonal work done in the MICBT program, but assertive communication, I think, is really important. Assertiveness has had bad press because it's been seen as a very kind of corporatized, get what you want at all costs, no matter how you you stamp on other people kind of thing. And this is very different within a mindfulness context. So it's different in that it's important that we develop, if we're to be mentally well, if we're to lead fruitful lives, it's important that we express our needs, and assertiveness is a way of doing that and hopefully getting our needs met. But it also incorporates important principles of doing no harm to self or other. And that comes from a sort of long lineage, if you like, of Buddhist ethical principles, not religious, but ethical principles. Because, of course, we don't want to do harm to ourselves, but we also don't want to do harm to others. So I guess it's pretty generic, and hopefully no one would disagree with that, of not wanting to do harm to yourself or to others. So how can we express our needs, ask for our needs to be met, but with a doing no harm to self or other? And that's one of the reasons why we developed this, established this practice. It also overlays some of the things that people are learning if they go through the program, which is something called experiential ownership. And basically what that means is that we're taking responsibility for our own experience. I'm taking a responsibility for the way that I feel because of the way that I think, the judgments I make in my own mind, rather than blaming the outside world. It's a sort of way of bringing the focus into something that we can control, which is our internal world, our thoughts, where our attention goes, etc. So that, and also the important thing about assertive communication within this context is that we're applying some of that equanimity, the calmness that people have developed in their practice in assertiveness, so that when they do relay their needs or sometimes resist someone's request of them that's not appropriate, then the message isn't lost by us engaging in emotional reactivity, so arguments or conflict, or sometimes giving in when it's not appropriate to do so, or pleasing a person, or avoiding the conversation in the first place. So using equanimity to be quite firm and assertive and calm, and then engaging in difficult conversations. So what I'll do is go through briefly the stages, and there's a handout that actually outlines this, and I'll give you a reference for the book, which is a self-help book on MICBT, which has a whole chapter about assertiveness. If this appeals to you, there's much more that you can read and build on. So I'll run through these, what we call these assertive statements. And basically what we're trying to do is to have some components to a discussion that we might have with someone if we want to express our needs, or we want to say no to something that's important to say no to. Then we need to think a little bit about how we're going to do that. And these are some guidelines in order to do this effectively. So the first thing, and we're using some principles here from psychology as well. The first is called reinforcement, where we can reinforce a behavior by giving it a positive reward. And so we use that principle during this, and I'll come to that as we go along. But the first step is, if we're going to have a discussion, we need to ask for a pay rise, or we need to say that we're overworked, or at home we need to get our partner to help us more, or our children to be more tidy, or whatever, all the the things that can be applied across a whole range of possibilities. But the first thing is we're going to need to get the other person's attention. So often we walk into a situation and start a conversation and we haven't prepared, and we haven't got their attention, and they're irritated in the first place. So that's not going to be a good start. So we ask for the person's attention. Can I talk to you now? Is this a good time? Or do I need to make an appointment? And then we thank them for giving their time to us, their attention to us. Because attention, of course, is really one of the greatest gifts that we can give to another person, our attention. And so we need to thank them. It also means they'll come back and give their attention again because they've had that little reward. And then when we've got their attention, then we can start off with stating the facts. And so we often don't really know what the facts are. We haven't really worked that out. We often start conversations with, you always do this, or you never do that. Whereas what we want to do is be precise, because if we state the facts, there's much less likelihood the other person is going to be arguing with us about it if it's a fact. So for the last 3 nights, you haven't done any washing up, or for the last week, you haven't, etc. So stating the facts is important. It's a reality. It's the objective reality. We then state how we feel. It's important in assertiveness to express how we feel. I feel angry, I feel worried, I feel upset, I feel whatever the feeling is. We state that clearly. But immediately after that, we state how we think, and we attach them together. Because I feel angry because I think that you don't care about me. So what I'm saying in essence is that my feeling comes about because of my thoughts. So I'm taking responsibility for that. I'm not saying you made me feel this way, you did this to me, because as soon as we blame the other person, they're not going to be listening and they're going to be reacting, and we want them to stay in the conversation. So I feel angry because I think that you don't care. And then we also follow that very quickly with an acknowledgement that they may not see it that way, because if we'll lose them unless we bring them back in. You may not see it that way. Your understanding may be different to mine. So acknowledging them, and again, that's rewarding. That means they're back in the conversation again, they're interested. The next thing is that we state what it is that we actually want. And I've worked with so many people who get to this and they haven't worked out what they want. They've worked out what they don't want, which is somewhat easier. And of course, when we work with, if you're a parent, if you've got kids, they often say, I don't want this and I don't want that. And you say, well, what do you want? And they say, oh, I don't know. Oh, I don't know. So what do we actually want? That's worth preparing in advance. And sometimes I find that when we start to prepare that, we actually start to question how important that really is. So it does, this strategy, if you like, gives us an opportunity to reflect on how important things are actually. And sometimes people change the goal at that point. So but we're going to be saying that we prepare it in advance and we tell the person what it is that we actually want. And then, of course, the rest, there's a pause, because at this point they're going to be responding, hopefully. And I do find in my experience that people often do. We've presented things factually. We're not blaming. We're being quite objective. We're being calm. Quite often, if it's reasonable, the other person responds fairly well, and that's wonderful. But if for some reason they can't or don't, it's important that we, reward their cooperation and attention, even if they don't give us the outcome we want, because we want them to come back to the table again. And we also don't want to rupture or harm our relationship. This is a pro-social strategy to maintain good relationships and sometimes even mend relationships. So we need to reward that they've given us their attention, even if they don't agree. And then we consider what a kind of win-win. In the Buddhists talk about a middle path. We often search for the middle path because that may be a way forward. So a compromise, or a chance to talk about it again, or some kind of needing to bring more information to the decision. So a win-win is about finding some way to keep this discussion open, or to find a different middle path, or to come up with something that feels okay on both both for both parties, doing no harm to either party. And that's if you haven't got their cooperation. It's quite likely that they will give you what you ask for if it's reasonable. So we then have a win-win solution. The relationship is maintained, and we can then also get them back to the table again to talk further about this. So these are the 7 statements. And what I do with people when I work with them is get them to, first of all, script a situation using those statements, and then rehearse it maybe with someone if need be. They can role play it and try it out until it becomes more fluid. And very quickly, people kind of internalize those statements so that they can enter into a dialogue using those and problem solve also if things really don't work. What's very important is that they maintain equanimity and calm. So they may be stating how they feel, but with calmness, no reaction, no blaming, no mind reading, some of the things I've put in the handout, so that we avoid getting back into conflict. And so it takes a bit of practice. And so what I wanted to do was just set aside some time. We're not meeting in person, but just for you individually to reflect on those statements. Try and think of a situation. It can be big or it can be small, where you want to say no to something or you want to ask for something. And just try and make some notes under each of those headings. What's the fact? How is it that you feel? And if you feel that, what was the thought that gave rise to that feeling? How could you acknowledge the other person? What is it that you want? And how can you reward the person for giving attention and what might be a win-win solution if they don't cooperate? And just make a few notes just for, let's call it 5 minutes, just on your own. It's nice when we can work in pairs, and if we have an opportunity for a workshop, but that might be a way of going forward. Just on your own, see if you can identify a situation that you would like to take on and practice these methods, and just make a little script, just some notes, just to get you thinking about it. If you don't want to make notes, just close your eyes and just reflect on what might be the facts of the situation, how you feel because you think that way, acknowledging the other person and what it is that you actually want, and what might be a middle path. And just reflect on that for a few minutes. I'll turn my camera off just for a few minutes. I'll rejoin you after that time's up. Hello there. I hope you've had just a few minutes to have a think and reflect about that. And if you have any questions, please do put those in the chat box, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I'm going to allow some minutes at the end. I wanted to just highlight some resources for people if they are interested in mindfulness training. You can see on this slide that there are several books that have been developed in relation to mindfulness integrated CBT. The first one, the blue, light pale blue one, is a self-help book, and I can really recommend that because it's written deliberately for people who want to work through the program or explore the program themselves. And as one of the stages is on interpersonal work, and that's outlined in that book. The one on the right, which I co-authored, is more of a clinical handbook for mental health professionals to be able to work through the program and administer it with clients. There's also audio instructions for all of the different mindfulness practices, including mindfulness of breath, which I think is the second on our program. We start off with a more relaxation strategy, muscular tension and relaxation strategy. And then on week 2 of the program, we move into mindfulness of breath, which is what you had a taster of today. So you can certainly have a look on the MICBT website. You can have a look, you may have, if you're interested in mindfulness, there may be other programs local to you. MICBT is one of the mindfulness interventions, but MBCT and MBSR are other ones that are provided by therapists and take people through mindfulness as a kind of therapy or well-being program. But there are also traditional mindfulness and meditation centers in most cities that teach meditation practice that shares really it's the same training. It's simply that the therapies use it and administer it gradually over weeks, whereas some other trainings are more intense, such as Vipassana training, which is 10 days, but about 10 hours a day of practice. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily for everyone. So there's many possibilities, and I'm very pleased to say that mindfulness is growing and its enthusiasm, and particularly there's greater enthusiasm for mindfulness and its application in the workplace, not just for increasing attention, but also increasing well-being and also increasing interpersonal relationships, and as a management tool and as a tool for managing difficult work situations. So thank you very much for listening and for me having your attention. And I'd like to pass you back to Stacey at this point to see if there are any questions, and that she might be able to chair that.
Thank you, Alice, and introducing us to mindfulness of breath, as well as those very important 7 assertive statements. We do have some questions, and I thank our participants for joining us online today. So the first question I've got is just clarifying that the acknowledging errors part of the 7 assertive statements is about the possible errors in the way that I think, or?
Good question. It's acknowledging the others. So we say how we feel. I feel angry because I think that you don't care. But then we acknowledge the other person. You may not feel that way. You may see it differently. So it's acknowledging that the other person may not share our point of view, and that we're really expressing that we have an interest in their point of view. So it might be something like, you may not see it that way. I understand that, you might not disagree with me. So it's acknowledging that they have a view too, and it may be different to ours. But it's so we acknowledge it. It doesn't mean we have to agree with it. We've already expressed what our feelings and thoughts are, and we take responsibility for that, and then acknowledge that they may see it differently. And it's a way of drawing the person sort of back into the conversation if they start to feel kind of blamed. And because even if we're very careful about our language, we know that the other person can, their thoughts may be reactive. So we may say something quite factual. For the last week you haven't done any washing up. I feel frustrated because I feel like you don't care enough. They may not hear that as a sort of factual statement. They may already, oh, she's blaming me, etc. And so we need to acknowledge that they may not see it that way, but doesn't mean we have to engage in their opinion at that point. We're just acknowledging it, and then we follow up with what it is that we actually want. And the idea is to keep this kind of emotional tone down. We call it diffusion. When if you are conducting the conversation, or you've requested the conversation to take place, that by you making sure that you're not reacting, and it doesn't mean we won't feel things in those sorts of discussions. There may be thoughts, and that may give rise, we might be feeling a lot of sensation or emotion, but by not reacting to it, staying calm, diffusion tends to occur where the other person doesn't get quite as reactive, because the old saying, it takes two to tango, so we can also practice diffusion by just trying to remain equanimous, and just having rehearsed it a little bit helps, because we've got a kind of mission. I need to say these things, and saying them calmly and with some precision, facts, seems to have a very helpful effect on potential conversations. I always say to people, start small, start with some easier ones, build up to the big ones when you've got practiced and you've kind of learned it. And of course, if you want to take up mindfulness practice, that really does help to prepare for those sorts of difficult conversations. So I've answered that, and I've added a bit more, but thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Alice. And we do have some more questions. So in terms of practice, is it a good idea to seek out a friend or, someone that you trust to practice first prior to, actually going through the 7 assertive statements and requesting that conversation?
That's a great question. It is worth practicing sometimes, particularly if it's a big thing. What you can do is, first of all, go through that scripting, like I was introducing to you, thinking about what it would be that you would say, what are the facts, etc., going through those statements and scripting it. And if you've got someone that you trust, you can actually do like a kind of role play, try it out, and get them to do some things that would make that a bit trickier. And they can give you some feedback about how they perceived that, how it felt on their end. You could even swap over and then get them to go through the script, and you now become the other person, see how it feels, how likely are you to respond, etc. And so you can do a bit of problem solving, because of course not every situation aligns perfectly with those 7 statements, and sometimes things go off plan, and if things get conflictual, we can decide to go straight to the win-win and say, perhaps now's not such a good time to talk about this, can we come back to it? So you can jump through if you need to hold that conversation, but still try and thank the person for their attention and their time. I really was helpful getting this off my chest, or thanks very much for listening. Can we come back to this at another time? So you could always halt it if you feel that it's difficult. And that's quite useful to try out in a role play. And when we go through the program with people, particularly where they've had lots of interpersonal difficulties, we definitely try and, do some work in sessions to role play so that they feel more confident to take that on.
Thank you, Alice. That's really interesting and very helpful. When we were doing the scripting, I found that really useful. So thank you for giving us the space to do that activity. And when I was scripting how I was feeling and what I was thinking, it kind of forced me to get specific with the language I was using. But in that moment, I felt quite vulnerable. And I wondered if there's any techniques for breaking that barrier in terms of having the courage to initiate that conversation and not, leaning into that fear.
Yeah, so well, first thing is definitely trying it with less emotionally salient situations. So trying it with things where there's not so much emotional kind of strength to it, more minor things. That can help, because then you get used to the technique, so you can kind of take that for granted when you go into situations where, again, you feel vulnerable. It also, of course, helps to have done some practice, because we can be aware of that vulnerability but not need to react to it, just observe it. But even without the practice, I guess the same recommendation is to just observe what takes place. And often it does take place when you're scripting or when you're role playing. And you kind of get a little bit of, you're doing a bit of exposure to that sensation or that emotion before you actually get in the real situation. So you're not taken by surprise in the real situation, because you probably felt it even in the script, as you point out, but certainly in a role play, it's likely to come up and it's like, there's that feeling. I need to be ready then when I have that conversation. That feeling might come up, and I need to just be able to sit with it, not react to it. Otherwise, we can take the conversation down a different path that may not be so helpful. But it may be also that it's part of the discussion. I feel vulnerable because I think. To express that, and then take responsibility for it may also be a possibility. But all of these things I think are really useful. But go at it. You don't want to, decide I'm going to have the real conversation that's been brewing for 10 years, and go straight into it, because you won't necessarily be prepared. So I would get the hang of it with other things. I recommend reading the book and the chapter for a bit more in-depth description of how it sits within mindfulness. But give it a go. And feeling vulnerable is, of course, in more advanced mindfulness, we do a lot of work on the body and being able to observe but not become perturbed by experiences within the mind and the body. And so feeling vulnerable, where is it? What is feeling vulnerable? Where in the body is that? What sensation is that? By observing vulnerability as an emotion and finding where it is, we find that we can sit with it. It's just sensations. And so I can have that conversation while feeling perhaps, and I'm sort of doing this because I guess it's often here that those sorts of things are. But so we can walk with it. We can be aware of it, but walk with it, rather than reacting to it in ways that might not be helpful, like avoidance or there's many ways to react. So, but be gentle with ourselves and kind to ourselves, because remember, doing no harm to self or others. So pace oneself, practice, get some support from other people, and then have a go with some gentle stuff, building your confidence, I would say.
Thank you very much. That's really, really helpful. I would like to now wrap up today's webinar by letting you know what will happen next. You will receive a statement of attendance. You will also receive access to the webinar questions, the slides, and a handout, as Alice mentioned today, to help you practice what you've learned. These resources will be stored in our LMS, and you'll be given access via a username and password, which will come from a separate email to you. As there are no further questions, I would like to conclude today's webinar. On behalf of my training, I would like to thank Alice for presenting today's session, and we'd like to thank you for being live with us today. The next webinar is on why vulnerability is not a dirty word in the workplace and will be held on Thursday, the 17th of August at 12 noon. We've made it really easy for you to register. Just click on the link on the last slide of the PowerPoint that you will receive. Thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful having you, Alice, and bye for now.